Hebrew is tricky.
Yeah.
Hebrew, what's part started?
Great.
Okay, so this is a good chapter this week. This might be the most famous chapter in all of Kohelet. Thank you to Pete Seeger, and also thanks to the birds. Fun fact: a great uncle of mine was the driver for the birds for a while in like the
Wow.
He's out in California.
Wow.
Yeah,
Great.
never had a chance to ask him about it, but if you knew him, it would fit. It would make sense.
Uh-huh.
But okay, so let's start with it. Let's start with it, and I want to say, well, let's start, and then I'll say. Okay, so if you're in the art scroll, we're on 1280. We're at the very beginning of chapter 3. Says Koheles lakol zman. Everything has a time. Be'es lechol chayfetz tachas hashemayim, and there's a time for every purpose, as the song says, or every I saw a bunch of every experience, every matter under heaven. Chayfetz is an interesting word, right? But any involvement, any kind of thing under heaven, there's a time for it. Now, a quick note on Zman versus Ace, right? They're both words that mean time. Ace or eight, you don't really see in modern Hebrew anymore. You just see Zman. But in the Torah and in the Tanakh, it's all over the place. And it seems like here, Zman is probably referring to a longer drawn out period, right? This is why there's a season, it often is translated as, in yeshivas, semester is called a Zman. So in some ways, the Zman might be the longer thing, and Ace might be a more, I don't want to say specific moment, but a more contained piece of time. So it's interesting that it's using two different words for time there. But now it's going to use the word ace for everything that it's about to say. So ace laledes, there's a time to be born, the ace lamus, and a time to die. Ace la taas, the ace la akor natua, there's a time to plant, and there's a time to uproot that which has been planted. I'm going to go through all of these and then we'll come back. Ace laharog, there's a time to kill, the ace lirpo, and a time to heal. Ace lifrots, a time to break down, the ace livnos, and a time to build up. Ace lichbos, there's a time to cry, the ace lischok, and a time to laugh. Ace sfod, right, there's a time to wail, the ace rekod, and a time to dance. But svod here, it's related to the word hesped, right? There's to eulogize. There's a time to eulogize or a time to wail over the dead, the ace rekod, and there's a time to dance. There's times of happiness. Ace lahashlich avonim. We'll definitely get back to this one. There's a time to cast away stones. The ace kinos avonim, and a time to gather stones. Ace lachavok. There's a time to embrace. The ace lirchok mechabek, and there's a time to distance yourself from embracing. Ace levakesh, there's a time to seek. The ace la'abed, and there's a time to lose. Ace lishmor, there's a time to keep. The ace lahashlich, and there's a time to discard. Ace likroa, there's a time to tear. The ace lipor, and there's a time to sow. Ace lachashos, there's a time to be silent. The ace ledaber, and there's a time to speak. Ace le'ehov, the ace lisno, there's a time to love and there's a time to hate. Ace milchama, the ace shalom, there's a time for war and there's a time for peace. What do you say, folks? What's going on over here?
Well, it fits the pattern of the repetition of experience,
Okay.
of things that are part and parcel of life, that are constant, almost unchanging in a certain sense, even though there's all this change here. They're the constants of life. These are the building blocks of life. They're not going to go away. There's literally a time to be born and literally a time to die. So the bookends are everywhere, and this goes through a number of them. Some of them very interesting and poetic and not fully transparent, and some of them are somewhat can contradict me. A time to plant and a time to pull up is not a
Yeah.
time to plant and a time to harvest. You know, it's a
Good.
time to plant and it's a time to, in a certain sense, destroy. You know,
Sure.
so there's all these. There's some of them are very anomalous, but I think that it's part and parcel of his overall vision that the fundamental building blocks of life don't change. We're all trapped
Okay.
in the same stratus of life. The matrix of life is permanent, and
Okay.
human beings have to deal with it.
Good. 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 I have what to say on that. Any other thoughts and comments before I jump in? Mark, just to catch you up, we read the first 9 psukim, the whole list of a time to be born, a time to die, a time, a time to this, a time to that.
Thank you.
So, okay. So what was striking to me, again, a few things. I'm going to talk broadly first, and then I'm going to go back to what you said about planting and uprooting, because I think you're 100% right about that. So I look at a couple commentaries to prepare. I have this old Sansino version of the 5 Megillos. It's an interesting mid-century work. Always interesting things to say. I'm borrowing from Rabbi Bellino the JPS, just like full commentary on it. I know it's blurry. But those are both digests with very interesting comments, and they're both kind of opposed on what's going on over here. So I will say Sansino notes that some people take this to be sort of a meditation on, if you're smart, there's like, I'll just read it. One interpretation of this section is that it is wisdom to do the right thing at the right time. And I think we'll get back to that. I think no matter how you understand it, that is part of it. And that's often how I've related to this chapter, is how to, you have to know there's a time for this and there's a time for that. And you have to know what time it is and to do the proper thing. But neither commentary takes that as the main point over here. Most of them are emphasizing in one way or the other the ways in which life is out of our control. And like you said, the matrix of life is unchanging. And we're all sort of subject to it. The Sansino wants to say that this is a deterministic chapter, namely that things are preordained and we can't really do much about it. That's a little uncomfortable to me. I think Judaism in general shies away from determinism. I think Judaism is not super into determinism, but JPS has an interesting twist on it, that it's not that it's deterministic, but it's that certain events in life and certain circumstances in life really kind of require certain actions and certain behaviors, right? It's less that God says right now is the time to be born, and it's more that the conditions are set up that here comes the birth, right? And it's a subtle distinction, but I think it's a good distinction. That it's not that we don't have a role to play or choices to make, but it is that a lot of the events of life really are beyond our control. And that is in keeping with Kohelet's broader message of the fleetingness of life and the degree to which the world keeps turning. Thoughts or questions until this point?
I just want to say, when I was a kid, I have a sister who's 9 years older than me, and the whole turn came, and she showed me this in Ecclesiastics when I was a kid. She was like, "You know where this comes from?" And she was like, and so this has always been. She doesn't remember doing it, and she's not not involved in Judaism at all. She's a non-believer, but it's very curious because I've always remembered that,
Cool.
and that was a long time ago now when I was 10.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sounds like it was very impactful and informative.
It was, yeah.
And it's interesting that this chapter got adapted like that. I think there's a lot of appeal. I think it's a very, you'll pardon me for saying so, I think it's a very Zen chapter in a certain sense. Like it's a very accept that there are trends within life and accept that there are different times and we have to act in different ways at those different times. Good. Okay. I want to zoom in a little bit more on certain specifics. So I already spoke about Zman, but I want to talk about uproot versus planting. So that's back in verse 2, verse Bays. There's a time to be born, a time to die, and then it says a time to plant and a time to uproot planting. Right. So Ethan pointed out that this is not a time to harvest, right? You would think the opposite of planting is harvesting, but this goes beyond harvesting, right? This is a total undoing. One is that you start something or you plant something, and one is a total undoing. So some commentaries and midrashim connect this to warfare, connect this to turning over fields as a destructive act in warfare. Again, there are a lot of laws in warfare, by the way, about not cutting down fruit trees and things like that. There are certain things that we have to make sure we're not destroying, even in war. But I guess turning over a field is different, right? It's less. You can sort of fix that better later on. But okay, that's neither here nor there. Maybe it's a destructive act in terms of warfare. Something that I liked that I think speaks more to us today is that it's also like a shift in careers, for instance, could be an uprooting, meaning you have your projects and your course of life that you've planted, and you're planting and you're harvesting and you're going along. And sometimes you need a real change. And sometimes that change means changing from the bottom up and even uprooting what's been done before and making a total 180. So I prefer that to talk about destruction during warfare. But those are two approaches that I saw that I think make sense. Okay. So the other really cryptic one is about stones, right? This is the 5th verse. Eis lahashlich avonim. There's a time to cast away stones. Ve'eis knos avonim. And there's a time to gather stones. Knos, like the same word as like Knesset, right? A gathering, to gather in stones. What do you folks make of this on a surface level, at least?
Well, I think it's very poetic, and
Okay.
it's not clear what's really going on. I've
Good.
heard sexual
Poetic for what?
interpretations. Well, maybe it's a time to speak up and not to speak up. Maybe it's a
Okay.
time to oppose and not to oppose. Maybe it's a time to waste time and not to waste time. Throwing stones and not throwing stones. There's some very famous proverbs that are literally use it as the metaphor for a lot of different things.
Okay.
So I think it intentionally it has a very wide avenue of interpretation.
Good.
The thing that comes to my mind is what we do at Rosh Hashanah, casting away bread
Okay.
to tashlik, and
Okay.
then a time to
Same
gather
word even.
stones. What's that?
Same word even. Lahashlich avonim and tashlich. It's the same word.
Interesting. And then a time to gather stones. That what comes to my mind is when you go to somebody's kever, somebody's gravesite, you put stones on it, and that was what came to my mind.
Okay, so jumping on that, I where Judy went to seminary is called Bat Ayin. I was there, but I was there in the '90s, and I don't know what it looks like now. But anyway, it was in Judea, and it struck me because it was not built up then. That there was so many stones piled up, like, and I guess I was told they're piled up to mark borders.
Sure.
So maybe, and if that was like a common thing in that time, if that's how people marked off their property, maybe that's what it's talking.
I like that. There's a time to put up the fences and a time to tear them down, so to speak.
Okay.
I like that. I mean, we have a similar verse that talks about that, but that's cool. That's good. I found three approaches. And they're all interesting. One is from the Targum, right? So the Targum is translation into Aramaic. Now, I'm not sure, right? In the Chumash, we have Targum Onkelos, right? Onkelos was a fellow who converted to Judaism in the 2000-ish years ago, and he translated the Torah into Aramaic. there's also the Targum Yonasan, who was that's most of the rest of Tanakh. So one of them and the Ibn Ezra, they say that this is referring to building materials on a very simple level, right? Sometimes you don't need to build, sometimes you can leave the extra rocks, you know, in the field or whatever. You can leave them behind the build site, you're not building. And then sometimes you have to gather them together and it's time to build a house, right? So that's not a very poetic meaning for a very poetic verse. What's interesting is there are a number of scholars who link this to apparently in Second Kings. I didn't get a chance to look up the story, but in Second Kings, apparently there was again in the context of warfare, they would throw stones into the fields because it makes it again harder to do agriculture in the fields. And Isaiah, 5th chapter of Isaiah, talks about gathering stones from fields in order to make it easier to then do the agriculture. When I was a kid, I went to a summer camp that was a very crunchy granola hippy dippy summer camp. It was great, one of my favorite places in the world. But every summer there was a farm next to the camp that during the summer we would get to do activities on the farm. And I guess the way to sort of help out and pay them back was that they would do a big harvest at the end of the summer, and we would go up and the kids would harvest, you know, onions and garlic and this and that. And it was child labor a little bit, but it was a learning experience, and we all had a love-hate relationship with it. But I'll tell you, the one task that became more and more common that I, as a camper, I just couldn't abide. I was really not happy about it, was instead of harvesting onions and garlic and whatever else, they had us harvest rocks from the fields. You know, now as an adult, I can appreciate that that's super important, you know, and I grew up in a place called Rockland County. There's a lot of rocks in the land over there. You know, but that's exactly this, right? You have to, in order to be able to till the fields properly and give the roots room to grow and to really aerate the soil, you have to get rid of all the rocks. So that might be what's going on over here. It might be an agricultural thing. And I will say, the Medrash relates it as a euphemism for sexual relations, right? So that's a very different understanding. But throwing stones is euphemistic for engaging in relations, and gathering stones is euphemistic for not engaging in relations, as related to laws of nida and ritual purity, and also related potentially to periods of mourning when, you know, we're not supposed to have relations there. So those are three kind of very different approaches in the Midrashim and in the commentaries to what are we talking about when we're talking about throwing and gathering stones. I will say about the Medrash and the euphemism, right? In some ways, that's the least compelling reading, and in some ways, it's the most compelling, only because the continuation of that same verse, the continuation of that same verse is that there's a time to embrace and there's a time to refrain from embracing, right? So that's all one verse: a time to cast stones, gather stones, embrace, refrain from embracing. So that could be. What does it mean that there's a time to lose? Do folks have a thought on that? Right? In the next verse, it says there's a time to seek and there's a time to lose.
I think
And
it's in,
and the simplest idea is that, you know, sometimes in life you lose things, and that's okay. I mean, I think the perspective from all this is, you know, from me, is that, you know, you always want to win, you always want to have the success, but in life there are times when you don't have that, and that's okay. That's how I think you could apply that to every one of these things from my thought. Yeah.
Great, great. Great. So part of why I'm asking is that one of the commentaries I was looking at has a lot of trouble with, to some extent, that's totally beyond our control. What do you mean a time to lose? If you lose something, you lose something. Like, it's not like there's no active part of it. And for that reason, some of the commentaries in a midrashic way, they reread it as a time to accept loss, which is maybe what you're saying, Mark, but they changed the grammar a little bit. Right. I think that's also from the Medrash. That there are times to accept a loss. There are times where you have to be okay with the fact that you didn't win this time.
I think, all of these are the stuff of life, these are things that are going to happen. I don't think it's deterministic because it's saying that, just over the course of a lifetime, you can expect some variation of these experiences, that they're fundamental, essential, inescapable. And it might be something as simple as you're going to lose stuff. Your wallet's going to fall out of your pocket, and your harvest is going to be eaten by locusts and whatever. It's really, there's a very practical element to it, where it's just saying this is the stuff. This is what's going to be. And I think it's very grounded and very specific in a certain sense. And I think that's an important part of the message that Kohelet is saying, like, this is life, and these cycles are inherent in the human condition.
Great. Good. Good. So with that, I think we'll do a little bit further. Because I think that's going to tie into the continuation a little bit over here.
I just
So
want
we're
to
in
say,
verse 9. Yeah.
I just want to say that, these are all like extremes. They're all one side and then the
Okay.
other side. And yet it's a question of the extremes bringing on the moderate.
Okay.
So that it's like Ethan is saying that, this is like the story of life, and it has both sides happening, and yet they're really not so extreme. They're just one side of the coin or the other side of the coin,
Okay.
and that they're all like day-to-day moderate happenings.
Sometimes it's a
So
big loss. Sometimes it's a small loss.
some,
Some,
yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about playing Mahjong, and when I lose, it's like I'm not good. I'm not really. I'm very, very upset.
sure.
But no. But I'm thinking about a time to keep silent, a time to speak. A time to love, a time to hate, a time for war, a time for peace. It's like it's the same coin. Is the
Okay.
is the idea that it's moderate, that
Okay.
it's like an average thing, and yet it's what's shown on each side of the coin.
Okay.
So anyway,
I would even say that in that way, maybe it sets up a spectrum, right? That's almost the opposite of a binary, but like it gives you the two ends, and maybe a lot of it happens between. It's a little dialectical also, right? You have two truths that seem to conflict a bit, but within it is just a reality of life. But two sides of a coin also, right? These are all related concepts. These aren't random. These are all they're part and parcel of each other to some extent.
yes. So to say that not one is good and one is bad. They both
Okay.
are. They both are, states of being. You know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they're also very important. They're not trivial things. War and peace, birth and death. This is it's like a compass where all the fundamental aspects of life, including something somewhat not mundane, but repetitive, are going to happen. And it's the next verse 9 that kind of brings home again my fundamental sense of Kohelet, my yitron. Okay, so what do you leave with? Well, again, you don't leave with anything, and I think like the contrast, Rabbi, that you surfaced a week or two ago it is the halek, the portion
Yeah.
versus the surplus. And I think that's not buried, but present in Kohelet. And I think that's almost one of the biggest parts of this message is don't hope for the surplus, hope for the portion.
That's great. That's great because that leads right into the closing thought I'll give is on the next verse. Um, and by the way, I think that theme that we've been exploring, I think the continuation of this chapter really, really digs into it. But the next verse, right?
I just want to say one thing
Yeah, please.
Judy, you were saying about good and bad. Um, I don't know that I think about these two things as good and bad, because like that's something that there's a time for certain things, that may be bad at other times, but it's good at that time. That's how I was thinking about it.
I
That's how I
wasn't
think
saying,
about
I don't think I said good and bad, because
Right.
I say that they're just states of being. It's
Right.
one side
Right.
or another, that
Right.
they both have merit and worth,
Right.
you
Right.
know, yeah.
Yeah. This is something that I've thought about. Something that's good. Well, I'm not saying you said this, Judy. Like it resonates with me. Like something that's good at certain times, or something that's bad at certain times, at other times may be good. That's how that's. It's like you don't know, and I think that's, to me, that's always an underlying theme of Kohelet. So anyway, just a thought.
Good. Okay, so yeah, so just because this is sort of a summary of this is linked to everything we've seen so far and sort of the end of this section. But ma yisron ha'ose ba'asher hu omel, right? That is verse 9. And Art Scroll says, what gain then has the worker by his toil, right? Ma yisron, what is the gain? Ha'ose, the worker, or in this case, the doer, really, ba'asher hu omel, in that which he is involved with, in that which he does. So good. So Yisron, right. So we want to say one of the things that's been developing as we've been going through this is that Yisron is talking about something a little bit more eternal, a little bit more transcendent. And he's recognizing again that, he's saying, where is that? Where is that here? Right. Again, life has its inevitable parts, and where is the Yisron? But an interesting thought that I saw, it was in the JPS commentary over here. They make a distinction between the verb asay and the verb amel, right? Because you have ha'ose over here, the doer, and that is the verb to do. That's the very common word to do. And then you have ba'asher hu omel, and everything that he's involved with. I would maybe expect it to say ma yisron ha'ose ba'asher hu asa. What the doer, what's he gaining in all that he's done? But here it's amel. And they wanted to make a distinction between ase and amel, as ase being doing what you need to do. We have to do stuff in life, doing what you have to do, and amel being overdoing it, that you're working too hard to amass all of this wealth, or in keeping with the theme of the chapter, maybe you're really trying to gather the stones when you should be scattering the stones. Maybe you're really trying to speak when you should be quiet. Maybe you're really being quiet when you should try to speak. When you're forcing it, when you're not working within the confines of life, when you're overdoing it and working too far against the surface, that really, even though you're doing it to try to get ahead and to try to get this permanence, that's when you really don't get it. Good. So I think it makes sense to hold here. Again, any final thoughts or questions before we say Auf Wiedersehen?
Rabbi, the only thing I want to defer to next week is the word hafetz. I'd
Okay.
like to really see
You want
more.
to go into it more?
Yeah, where it's used, because I think that's,
Good.
purpose. Is it really, it's asking something as kind of modern existential as what is the purpose of life? So I'd like
Okay.
to hear more about that. That's an interesting word. And I'd like to hear more about that.
Good. That's great. I'll definitely do that. Great. Okay, well, thank you all
All
for
right,
joining.
thank you, Rabbi.
Same time,
Beautiful.
same place
Thank you so
next
much.
week.
Okay,
And
you
have
bet.
fun. Very good.
Okay, stay well.
All right.
Have a good
Thank
week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.